Good morning. My name is Terence Lyons, and it's a great pleasure to see so many of you here on an August morning to have a discussion about politics and conflict in Africa. I'm from George Mason University, from the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. I'll do a brief introduction and then allow our presenter today, Michael Wooldemariam, to make his points. First, let me welcome you on behalf of the Wilson Center's Africa program. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Wilson Center, it was established in 1968 by an act of Congress to serve as a living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. The center provides a forum for research and discourse through a number of programs and projects, with a particular strength in international affairs, a reflection of President Wilson's strong advocacy of international understanding. The Wilson Center aims to bridge the gap between the world of ideas and the world of policy. I think we'll see that in Michael's paper soon. It's not an advocacy think tank developing specific policy recommendations, but a nonpartisan center for advanced study, a neutral forum for free and open, serious, and informed scholarship and dialogue. Under the direction of Howard Wolpe, the Africa program capitalizes on the center's location in Washington, D.C. to promote dialogue among policymakers and academic specialists on both African issues and U.S. policy towards Africa. It's a great, as I said, a great pleasure this morning to be able to introduce to you Michael Wooldemariam, who was one of this summer's 2008 Africanist doctoral fellow at the Africa program here. What he's going to present is his doctoral research project entitled Why Rebels Collide, Factionalism and Fragmentation in African Insurgencies. Michael is, he's, as I said, a PhD candidate with research interests in African politics, security studies, identity, international development. This project, I've had the opportunity to speak to him about this project before, is, I think, focuses on a particularly critical issue for our understanding of conflicts not only in Africa but elsewhere, but let's emphasize the Africa nature today. Many of the theories and concepts that we have on conflict, for simplicity's sake, think of it in terms of, well, party A and party B have to get together and make a peace, reach an agreement, get to yes, and so on. And that's always been a simplification for the purposes of developing theories, but it's become increasingly not useful, or not as useful as it could be, to understand critical issues such as African insurgencies. And we know that the nature of the rebellion, the insurgent group, matters greatly. Some have already helped us understand that it matters for the likelihood of conflict, for the nature of the conflict, for the prospects of reaching an agreement, questions of spoilers and the difficulty of implementing an agreement if there's lots of factions, issues relating to post-conflict governance, how the nature of the rebel movement shapes the nature of the subsequent government. But what I don't think we know nearly enough about, and what Michael helps us understand, is why do some groups split and some don't? What is the timing of the split and so forth? And so the research that Michael is about to present to us, I think, helps us understand the nature of the problem, the empirical basis of the problem, but then also explores whether or not looking at it as a cooperation problem gets us some leverage on this critical issue. So with that as my introduction, Mike, I look forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you.
So before I begin my presentation, I think a few quick thank yous are in order. First, I'd like to thank the Africa program here, who have been fine hosts for my 3 months at the center. I'd also like to thank Ted Powers and Julie Guillat, who are in the audience, and who not only provided comments and feedback on this project, but have also been great companions over the summer. I'd also like to thank my 3 advisors at Princeton, who have been with this project from the inception and have been critical to helping me shape sort of my thinking about rebel movements and African patterns of fragmentation. And my advisors are Jennifer Widener, Mark Beisinger, and Jake Shapiro. A very big thank you is in order to Brian Chevenot, my research assistant for the summer months, who was actually critical to putting some of the original data, putting together some of the original data that you will see in this presentation. So kudos to him. I'd also like to thank Terrence Lyons for being here and for agreeing to moderate this panel. He's one of the foremost scholars of Horn of African politics here in the United States. And I think certainly does lend this project a degree of credibility. So I thank him for being here. So the title of this project, as you all can see, is Why Rebels Collide: Factionalism and Fragmentation in African Insurgencies. And I think before we begin, it's important to outline the agenda for today's presentation. The first thing I want to talk to you guys a little bit about is the empirical puzzle. In other words, what's the research question? Second question, why should we care, right? All researchers should ask this about their projects in their research questions, right? What's the significance of this question? It may seem obvious why the fragmentation of rebel organizations is significant, but I think I'll tease out some other significant factors that are not altogether obvious. I'm going to talk about, after that, some key concepts and definitions, talk about some existing explanations, and then talk about a theoretical framework I want to use for approaching the fragmentation of rebel organizations, and that's to use some of the insights from cooperation theory to give us leverage on this problem. Then I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between fragmentation and coups, a relationship that's not altogether clear, but I'd like to tease that out for you guys. And then I'll move to some brief conclusions. It's important to note that throughout this presentation, I use some original data that I've collected over the summer months. And so this is the first time this is being presented, and I'll talk about the data at some length. A very important point to make at the outset, an important caveat, is that I don't really provide a causal story here about the fragmentation of rebel organizations. This is part of my dissertation. Frankly, in its early stages. So for those of you that were looking for a definitive answer to why rebels collide, talk to me in a year, and I'll let you know. But what I offer here, I think, is a theoretical approach and a perspective, right? Really a first step in sort of addressing this question of rebel fragmentation. So the empirical puzzle, right? What's a research question? Well, as you see on the projector, it's why do some organizations of violence maintain a high degree of solidarity while others succumb to the vagaries of political factionalism? More specifically, what explains spatial and temporal variation in the splintering of rebel organizations? What explains the variation across time and space in the fragmentation of rebel organizations? It's important to note that this is a positive theory of rebel fragmentation as opposed to a normative theory. And the intention here, the design, is to develop a generalizable theory, right? So this isn't a theory about the fragmentation of a particular rebel organization. It may not explain every case. The idea is that I develop a theory that ports to multiple contexts. So let's in fact look if there is a puzzle, if there is some variation to be explained. Now this is original data, and I will in fact talk about this data a little bit more in the method of collection. But this chart on the board shows the percentage of rebel organizations in sub-Saharan Africa that are fractured between the years 1946 and 2006. You can see that we're dealing with an N of 171, a sample of 171 organizations, and I can talk about how, in fact, I've arrived with that number of rebel organizations and constructed the sample, et cetera. But you can see roughly a third of rebel organizations have fractured. And also talk a little bit in the latter half of the presentation about how fragmentation, how fracturing is defined. But I think a fairly interesting finding. The this chart here shows the percentage of fractured rebel organizations in sub-Saharan Africa that have fractured multiple times, right? So even within organizations that have fragmented, right, there is some variation, sort of the extent of fragmentation, right? So we see that fragmentation is not necessarily a chronic condition, right? About 20% of organizations that have fragmented at least once have fragmented multiple times. And you see we're dealing there with a sample of 54. So keep in mind the small sample size. So let's move to this question of why should we care, right? And it's important to ask this question because it's not altogether clear why, out of all the different features of civil war, we should care about the fragmentation of rebel organization. Well, I think that we should care about the fragmentation of rebel organizations in part because casual observations suggest that the fragmentation of rebel organizations are closely linked to patterns of state failure in late 20th century Africa. Now keep in mind, I'm not claiming that the fragmentation of rebel organizations necessarily causes state failure, right? State failure is a complex outcome determined by multiple factors, right? But simply to suggest that the fragmentation of rebel organizations is part of the story. So in many of Africa's failed states of the 1990s, state failure was in part brought on by the inability of one or two original rebel organizations to seize and consolidate state power, and in fact to cohere. So as the institutional edifice of the old state collapsed, rebel organizations often split into several opposing camps, turning what should have been a successful, albeit violent, political transition into endemic chaos and chronically failing state institutions. Now, however, this all too common story stood in stark contrast to what we witnessed in several African countries, where rebel organizations maintained internal cohesion and successfully seized control over the apparatus of the state as the old regime collapsed. And these differing trends are closely related to the distinction Chris Clapham, a British political scientist, has drawn between what he calls state consolidating insurgencies and state subverting insurgencies. So really, if we care about the contemporary phenomenon of state failure, we probably should care about the causes of rebel fragmentation. So here's an illustration of what I'm talking about. Somalia at the end of the Cold War. Now, while there were several rebel organizations operating in Somalia following the collapse of the regime of Siad Barre in Mogadishu in 1991, the most likely to assume power were the Somali National Movement, which occupied the area that we now call Somaliland, and the United Somali Congress, who had taken Mogadishu and most of central and southern Somalia, right? However, leadership disputes between Ali Mahdi and Mohammed Faradid led to a bitter split in the USC along sub-clan lines, and basically led to sectarian conflict in Mogadishu. By contrast, the SNM actually held together, maintained its internal discipline, and effectively filled the political vacuum in Somaliland that Barre's departure had created. As a result, Somaliland transitioned into a period of sustained peace and prosperity, while the rest of Somalia remained mired in conflict. Now, neighboring Ethiopia and Eritrea, we saw a different pattern from what we saw in Mogadishu and southern Somalia in early 1991. In Eritrea, the EPLF maintained its internal cohesion and successfully filled the power vacuum left by the collapse of the communist regime of Mengistu Haile Mariam. In Addis Ababa, the TPLF emulated the EPLF's successes and consolidated state power in Ethiopia. And of course, this stands in marked contrast to events in Chad and Liberia. So one can see, the differing outcomes in terms of state failure. So why else should we care beyond issues of state failure? There's been some literature that suggests that splintering tends to lengthen the duration of civil wars. And we can think about a variety of causal logics, but the basic idea is that when there's multiple sides to a conflict, it's essentially more difficult to negotiate a peace agreement, right? There are just too many different sides. Fragmentation can also impact the effectiveness and ultimate success of rebel organizations, and that's in fact implicit in the story that I told you all about state failure. Another important point, and perhaps a more minor point, but important for me as a political scientist, is that the fragmentation of rebel organizations has important theoretical implications. The Civil War literature tends to treat rebel groups as a black box whose members have uniform preferences and a common identity, tend to treat them as homogenous. And really what I'm trying to do in this project is open up that black box and take a more complex look at rebel organizations and their internal dynamics. So let's talk about some important concepts and definitions. So what is a rebel organization? Part of my data is drawn from the PRIO Armed Conflict Dataset, which defines a rebel organization as a non-governmental group of people formally organized, having announced a name for their group. A group should also have used armed force to influence the outcome of a stated incompatibility. And incompatibility could be territory, could be conflict over the central government. A rebel organization should also be a group whose military activity must be part of a planned political campaign rather than spontaneous violence. And so you can see now how we begin to differentiate between rebel organizations and other violent actors of violence, organized crime, etc. And the group must at least be involved in a military event resulting in at least 25 casualties. So they must be an organization of some capacity, right? And so this is a definition that I essentially use when constructing, when deciding what rebel groups to include in this study, right? As sort of a population for analysis. So still dealing with this question, what is a rebel organization? The sample of organizations that this study analyzes are the 160-odd African rebel organizations that PRIO has identified in the period between 1946 and 2006, in addition to several other rebel organizations that have been identified over the course of this research, because PRIO is not perfect and they have missed some rebel groups, so we've included others, and that's brought us to a grand total of 171 rebel movements. So here you see the breakdown of rebel organizations by country in sub-Saharan Africa, and you will note that Chad comprises, rebel groups in Chad comprise a disproportionate amount of disproportionate percentage of rebel organizations in this sample. So that's something that's important to note, and we can talk about issues of bias later on. One would also note, and this is sort of drawing a connection between this chart and patterns of state failure. But one will also note that countries that tend to have the most rebel organizations also tend to be those that have suffered from chronic instability and fairly protracted civil conflicts. And I mean, this chart doesn't necessarily demonstrate that point perfectly. Others make that point much better than I do, but one can see that Chad, Uganda, Sudan, countries that have many rebel movements tend to have also suffered from protracted conflict, civil conflict. So how exactly do we define rebel fragmentation? Not altogether obvious how we would define the dependent variable, so to speak. Well, I would argue that fracture occurs when a non-trivial portion of rebel organization formally exits that organization and does one of two things. Either establishes a new rebel organization, right, or joins another existing rebel organization. So the key issue, of course, here is what exactly does non-trivial mean, right? Well, in the case of A, where a new rebel organization is being established, it's fairly obvious. That organization should have some capacity to operate independently. We need to have some evidence of that. And also should have some formal organizational structure. In the case of B, it's a little more murky, and we do the best we can with the information we have. But really, in a case, B could be considered a case of realignment, right? And so what we're looking for here is that a splinter element has basically added significantly to the capacities of the movement to which it is joined, added significantly in terms of resources, resources available to this rebel organization that they've joined. And I should note up front that I have huge concerns with the data and the coding. Right, this is a preliminary data set, and it's possible at the margins that we've coded movements wrong, that we've miscoded cases of fragmentation, that there's inconsistencies. But I will say that I think, frankly, we've underreported the extent of fragmentation of rebel organizations in Africa because of the fairly strict criteria that we're using. So what are some of the existing approaches to rebel fragmentation? The Civil War literature doesn't really deal with issues of rebel fragmentation and factionalism insurgencies, at least not in a comparative way. The Civil War literature tends to focus on sort of three questions. The first is, why do civil wars occur? The second would be, why do civil wars end? And the third would be, what explains the nature and scale of violence against civilian populations, right? So I'm asking a different question. Because I'm asking a different question, the literature doesn't really provide a lot of insights. That being said, I think we could sort of glean out what some possible causal stories would be about rebel fragmentation. There is a theory about a distinction that I don't particularly like between old civil wars and new civil wars. And the idea here, and drawing on sort of recent evidence and experience from very bloody civil wars in West Africa, Darfur, what have you, the idea is that for some reason, rebel movements that have sort of emerged in the post-Cold War era, not highly ideologized, very factionalized, are essentially bad rebel organizations, right? And so there's this contrast drawn between old civil wars and new civil wars. So one would think, given this common perception that new civil wars tend to fragment more often, right? And you can see a quote here from Stathis Kalavas at Yale, and he basically writes, most versions of the distinction between old and new civil wars stress or imply that new civil wars are characteristically criminal, depoliticized, private, and predatory. Old civil wars are considered ideological, political, collective, and even noble. The dividing line between old and new civil wars coincides roughly with the end of the Cold War. So let's interrogate this this claim. So one can see in this chart basically we have the number of rebel organizations broken down pre and post Cold War, and the number of fractures observed. And you can see that even though there's more rebel organizations in the post Cold War era, there's fewer fractures, right? So it really completely contradicts sort of the claims of those who draw a distinction between old civil wars and new civil wars. In fact, we can break it down into percentage terms, and you see essentially in the post-Cold War era, 26% of rebel organizations have fractured, while in the pre-Cold War era, 37%. Apologies. So let's move to some other existing approaches. Jeremy Weinstein, and perhaps what is, I think, the best book on the internal political dynamics of rebel organizations, suggests that the structure and cohesion of rebel groups is a function of their resource base. Basically, in this story, he divides rebel organizations into two categories: resource-rich and resource-poor. Right? Resource-rich movements, because they have resources, are able to provide material incentives to combatants in terms of in the process of recruiting, right? And because they do this, they tend to attract a particular kind of recruit. They tend to attract opportunists. So you're not really attracting people that are highly committed to the movement, and because of that, one would infer fragmentation is more likely later on. It's important to note that this is a path-dependent story. This is a story about how the conditions that a rebel organization faces at the outset determine outcomes later on. But the problem, of course, with this theory is that it really addresses the propensity of movements to fragment, but not really the timing of fragmentation, right? The latter, I think, would require a more dynamic variable that can explain sudden events and rapid change, right? The natural resource base of a movement, the natural resource base that a movement starts out with is not really a variable that changes, right? Can't really explain why we see sudden fragmentation. Now, Gates in 2002, in a very interesting article, argues that geography and ethnic composition exacerbate principal-agent problems within rebel organizations, and basically, in essence, make it more difficult for rebel organizations to police defection. So you can imagine in a rebel organization that operates over sort of a very wide geographic territory, it's very difficult to prevent your subordinates from defecting, right? Fairly intuitive. With respect to ethnicity and ethnic diversity, the idea here is that if one of your subordinates is of a different ethnic group, a different tribe, different clan, what have you, it's very difficult to bring social pressure to bear on this subordinate and to keep him in the rebel organization, right? It's a little more difficult to sanction someone socially who's of a different ethnic group, right? Shapiro, in 2007, and this is unpublished material actually, this was part of his dissertation, but suggests that state repression increases the insecurity of rebel organizations. In particular, he's talking about terrorist organizations. And basically forces decentralization and exacerbates principal-agent problems, making it more difficult to police defection. And this is actually a fairly common story in rebel organizations. People often talk about decentralized organizations fragmenting because of their organizational structure, etc. The problem with this story is that it doesn't focuses on the capacity to fragment, right? Decentralized organizations fragment because they're decentralized, right? And leaders can't sanction their subordinates. So in focusing on the capacity, we often miss what the actual motivations of potential splinter elements are, right? And so that's something that's important to focus on. So my claim would be a revamped, more interesting theory of rebel fragmentation should explain both the timing of fragmentation, right? This should be a dynamic story, and thus its precipitating causes, as well as the motivations of those who seek to splinter. I think this should be our starting point. So here I write a plausible theory, rebel fragmentation and the problem of cooperation. Cooperation problems are fairly ubiquitous in the field of political science and economics. It's often used to explain problems of international cooperation, cooperation between states, etc. But here I use it as a starting point for an approach to explaining the fragmentation of rebel organizations. Now, while one could view fragmentation from a variety of perspectives, I would argue that fragmentation represents a breakdown in a previously cooperative relationship between a leader and organizational elites. And so organizational elites are really the key actor here, at least in my story. And some may ask, well, why do you focus on organizational elites? Why is this an elite theory? Well, frankly, if you look at fragmentation in Africa, it's really only elites that have the capacity to mobilize a constituency, right? And mobilize that constituency to fragment, right? And this is really how one. This is really important because otherwise, if a sizable constituency doesn't fragment, then there's no way to really distinguish, what I see as non-trivial fragmentation from defection or desertion, for example. Now, cooperation, we often don't think about intra-organizational cooperation in rebel movements. But I think that cooperation in rebel organizations exists because the interaction between a rebel leader and organizational elites is based on an implicit or in some cases formal contract through which the leader provides benefits to organizational elites, and those benefits could be broadly construed. And in turn, organizational elites recognize the authority of the leader and obey his directives. So I think really the fact that organizational elites challenge the authority of a leader through splintering then suggests that the conditions that have sustained cooperation really no longer obtain. For whatever reason, certain shocks, and remember, I'm not making causal stories, so I'm sort of agnostic at this point about what those shocks would be. Certain shocks have occurred that change the underlying incentives that certain organizational elites have to remain in a rebel organization under the current leadership. In other words, to cooperate. So by treating the fragmentation of insurgent organizations as essentially a breakdown in intra-organizational cooperation, I think we can begin to create a more fine-grained explanation that accounts for both the timing of fragmentation as well as the motivations of those who choose to splinter. Apologies. Not the most efficient up here, but here we go. So, I mean, even though the story of rebel for fragmentation may be a cooperation problem, I think there's really two paths, or we can identify two paths to the fragmentation of rebel organizations. The first would be a story about preference divergence, right? And this is a fairly sort of common story in a lot of the ethnographic work on rebel organizations, right? And that is essentially that the interests of organizational elites and a rebel leader become incompatible. They diverge, and because they become incompatible, cooperation essentially breaks down, right? And so one could have preference divergence over ideology, policy differences. So we could think about a couple examples here. The SPLA, a fairly well-known movement operating out of southern Sudan, essentially, there had been long-standing differences in the SPLA over the future of South Sudan and what the future of South Sudan should look like. So there were those who thought that South Sudan should be an independent country, right? And those were those like John Garang, who essentially thought that, quote-unquote, the new Sudan, South Sudan should be part of the new Sudan, right? A new secular Sudan. And so these differences existed, but essentially blew up in 1990 with the fall of the government of Sadiq al-Mahdi. This was actually in 1989. Sadiq al-Mahdi was essentially replaced by Omar al-Bashir and the Islamists, who essentially took a very hard line against the SPLA and basically refused to accede to any of the South's demands for autonomy. And essentially what this did was it radicalized the pro-independence elements of the SPLA and basically created the impression that they could never be part of a secular Sudan, right? And it was in that way that preference divergence, the result of sort of this shock, right, the overthrow of Sadiq al-Mahdi, basically created the circumstances under which cooperation broke down and that rebel organization split, right? One could also have preference divergence over economic rewards, right? And so in this, in the Civil War literature, there's a debate about whether the motivations for war are about grievance, right, or whether they're about greed. And so this would be sort of a greed-based explanation of rebel fragmentation, right? And so we can see, for example, with Charles Taylor NPFL in Liberia or the United Somali Congress in Somalia, essentially what happened in these cases is that organizational success, right, the rapid success of these movements, in fact, the USC had basically seized Mogadishu, and the NPFL was on the outskirts of Monrovia. This organizational success basically increased the value of leadership, right? And because it increased the value of leadership, in many ways increased the incentive the organizational elites had to basically start their own movement, etc. So these would be stories about preference divergence. But I think there's another path. There's another path to fragmentation that's less well known, right? And this is really a story about commitment problems. And really, if we think about all forms of cooperation, they really depend on the belief. All forms of intra-organizational cooperation, they all depend on the belief that the other side will uphold their end of the bargain, right? And so commitment problems really occur when one side, here in most cases the leader, cannot really credibly commit to uphold his end of the bargain. So it's not really a story about interests being different or interests diverging, right? It's a problem, it's an issue of the credibility of commitments within an organization, right? And so commitments can be credible in two ways, right? They can be motivationally credible, right? In that, and this is a distinction that Shepley draws, but they can be motivationally credible in the sense that no one has an incentive to violate the cooperating arrangement, right? So the status quo persists, right? Or they can be imperatively credible, right? In that no one has the capacity to basically alter or violate this cooperative arrangement, right? And so, so one could think of a variety of examples where commitments fragment or cooperation occurs because commitments are no longer motivationally credible. And here I highlight two examples: Somalia, the United Somali Congress, and in this case, and one could tell a variety of stories about why fragmentation breaks down in this case. But in this case, the rapid success of this organization and the increasing rewards, right, of leadership, right, because whoever was actually head of the USC would eventually be president or leader of Somalia. Because of that, organizational elites essentially felt that the leader basically had an incentive to violate the cooperative arrangement and basically crack down on them, right? Basically violate their rights, seize power, etc. Right? In the case of imperative credibility, Sudan and the SPLA, I think, provide another really good example. And in this case, essentially what happens in 1990 is that Sudan loses, because of the fall of Mengistu Haile Mariam in Ethiopia, Sudan essentially loses the support of its Ethiopian backers. And the Ethiopian backers had essentially been a key restraint, at least literature suggests, on John Garang and the kind of authority he expressed over his subordinates, right? And in fact, many of his subordinates had been key allies of the Ethiopian government. So the loss of this external backer that had basically restrained Garang basically gave Garang the capacity to crack down and violate his cooperative arrangement with other organizational elites. And so it's in that way that we could talk about the breakdown of an imperatively credible commitment in rebel organizations. Now, some of you may ask, well, who cares, right? Who cares if it's a story about preference divergence, or who cares if it's a story about credible commitments? And I think it's important to think about the different paths because the policy prescriptions would be different, whether you're into counterinsurgency or whether you're interested in holding these rebel groups together, right? The policy prescriptions, I think, would be very different. So let's talk about the second piece of the puzzle, right? A lot of theories of splintering, whether it's splintering in firms or other similar organizations, tend to assume that splinter elements have sort of a dichotomous choice between staying in an organization or leaving and splintering, right? But if we view splintering as an extra-legal action, this is my language here, that subordinates use to usurp and challenge the ultimate authority of a rebel leader, then we need to ask why splinter elements would select splintering over a coup, right? In fact, a coup may often be the less costly option for subordinates that are dissatisfied with the status quo, right? And so we can think about the costs involved in creating a new rebel organization right from the ground up, right? It can be very costly in some cases. Yet I would argue if the success of a coup, either in the short or long term, is unlikely, fragmentation becomes a preferred option. And so we can actually look here. So in this chart, basically, comparative chart that shows the percentage of rebel organizations in Africa that fractured, and actually the percentage of rebel organizations in sub-Saharan Africa with a successful internal coup. And what's striking about this is actually how little or on how few occasions internal coups have actually occurred, right? And there's a variety of ways we could read these results, and I don't want to make any big causal claims, but it may be the case that because internal coups are so difficult to pull off in the context of rebel organizations in Africa, fracturing becomes a more palatable and, in fact, the rational option, right? But again, this is preliminary data. I don't want to read too much into this. To move back, it's also important to note that fragmentation can often be a second-order unintended effect of a failed coup. This is actually what happened in the case of the SPLA in 1990. Those that opposed Garang essentially announced that he was no longer their leader, attempted to pull off an internal coup. The central committee of the organization stayed with Garang. And those who opposed Garang essentially had no choice but to exit the SPLA, right, and create their own rebel movements. Okay. So some broad conclusions, right? First, the variation in the fragmentation of rebel organizations, I think, represents an important empirical puzzle. And we can think back to the chart where we saw that 32% of rebel organizations, by my count, have fragmented. The fragmentation of rebel organizations is an important research question, both practically and theoretically, in terms of issues of state failure on the one hand, and in terms of the basic inadequacy of the Civil War literature. Also, in order to understand why rebels collide, we need to understand how and why they cooperate. So we need to think about we need to understand why they cooperate. So we can think back to how I described rebel fragmentation as a breakdown in a previously cooperative relationship. And lastly, I think we need to think about the relationship between fragmentation of a rebel organization and coups, right? And it's not altogether clear what that relationship is, but it seems fairly obvious to me that coups and splintering essentially may have the same causes, right? And so we need to explain, right, why after cooperation breaks down, fragmentation is selected over coups, right? And so towards the future. The fieldwork for this project has actually not been conducted yet. So I'll be doing some comparative case studies of rebel organizations in the Horn of Africa. And that will be conducted next year, or actually this academic year. And then hopefully, if the data can be cleaned and can be deemed reliable, to use some statistical analysis to get some leverage on this problem. So with that quick bibliography, this will be posted online for those of you who want to glance at the presentation and my contact information. So thank you for your time. I look forward to your comments and feedback.
Thank you so much for that very thorough presentation. We now actually have quite a bit of time for questions and answers, which is I'm very happy about. I have a couple of questions, but I'm actually going to feed them in through the course of other questions. So what that means is I prefer to open it up to some of you to begin with. I'll ask that you please identify yourself. Keep your questions as brief as they can be, and I'll start back here, sir. And there's a cordless mic, so if you could speak into the microphone, that'll be wonderful.
Thank you. Am I on?
Now it's on.
Okay. I'm Tim Resch, USAID. On a policy side, with a third of the rebel movements fracturing, it would seem to make sense if peacemakers were negotiating with rebel movements, that one would be wanting to be talking to many of the organizational elites versus focusing on the leader of the movement, which leads into some questions of, would that discussion then further exacerbate or increase the possibility of fracturing.
Right. I mean, I think that's an excellent lesson to draw from this presentation, right? That organizational elites are a key actor, and in fact, their interests and preferences need to be accounted for in peace agreements, peace negotiations, what have you. There is, of course, the other side of the equation, and that is in recognizing the authority of the authority, power, whatever of these organizational elites. We're in a sense lending them some credibility and may in fact be creating the basis for fragmentation at some later date. So, right. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword.
Next question. Yes, sir. Up in front. The microphone's coming.
I didn't see a...
Can you identify yourself, please?
Sunil Dasgupta, GW.
Sure.
The one thing I thought sort of is kind of missing from the story that you're trying to tell is the role of the state and government and authority actors, whatever. And the idea is that, and there is a part of it, of course, in Shapiro, where repression, you said, leads to certain kinds of fragmentation. But there is bribery and, buying off different rebel groups, factions. And that would fall under your category of external shock, I think. But there is a clear sort of external agency that is working there, and I wonder if you might address that.
Can I actually tag one of my questions onto that
Sure.
and frame it? I think it's a great point, and I want to even maybe broaden it. As you defined fracture, you were pretty clear that you measured it by either they formed a new organization or they realigned and joined another rebel organization. But isn't there often a third option that is also a split, and that is that they split and they join the government, either through bribery or because they're offered seats at the government, seats in the parliament or the cabinet, whatever it might be. And that at least, I was surprised you didn't include that as a third way of seeing a fracture.
Right, and I think you're exactly right on that point. And that is one shortcoming of the data. My defense would be that I'm interested essentially in the proliferation of rebel groups, right? And so when you see fragmentation and and a faction joins the government, they wouldn't be defined as a rebel group any longer, right? By my definition. So that would be my defense, but clearly an inadequacy in the data, certainly. With respect to the role of the state, in complete agreement, and it's likely that external shocks, right? We talk about external shocks that lead to a breakdown of cooperation. That may very well be related to state behavior, right? And the incentives and disincentives that states provide to particular organizational elites, particular actors in rebel organizations. So certainly I'm with you on that point. And in future iterations of this project, as I begin to sort of pin down particular hypotheses about why fragmentation occurs, certainly going to account for the role of the state, right? But I would also argue that the role of the state, at least as I see it, should be seen through the lens of a breakdown of cooperation, right? And how sort of incentives, how the state creates incentives for a breakdown of cooperation, right? So that could be through bribery, particularly harsh counterinsurgency strategies, et cetera, right? But I'm with you.
Other question? Yes, here in the aisle, and then I'll move my way to the other side, let the microphone move to there. But let me start with this lady right here.
My name is Deirdre Lepin.
If you could use the...
Thank you. My name is Deirdre Lepin. I'm an independent consultant who works on corporate responsibility, but I'm soon to be a scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. So thank you for an excellent presentation. It was very stimulating. I wanted to ask you to what extent you have extended your thinking to the hundreds of other militant, insurgent, gang, freedom fighter, agitator groups that operate all over Africa. You describe groups that are essentially formally organized, as you said, and they are also politically motivated. But thinking about Terence Lyons' last question or comment, which is that these groups are very open often to being bought off or being absorbed into a political system or even being utilized to support an existing political structure. I mean, there are politicians who will use these groups, for example, as their own personal militias, for example. So they can operate as almost a parallel structure rather than a force that is opposed to the state, but one that helps to prop up certain parties or groups within the state.
Right. So I will note that this, because we define. Because I've defined a rebel organization as an organization that has formal political goals and has a stated sort of incompatibility with the state, I'm excluding, militias that the state has organized, a la Darfur, to fight other rebel organizations. But yes, I mean, I'm very sort of clear about what I define rebel organizations to be, right? And perhaps. We need to broaden our thinking about what rebel organizations actually are. I was working with the PRIO data set, right? And they have a very sort of clear way, because if you want to define rebel organizations, you got to define them in a clear and consistent way. And so that's in part why I use that organization. One could also talk about sort of terrorist organizations, and I tend to see sort of terrorism as a tactic. So many organizations that are considered sort of terrorist organizations would actually be included in this data set as a rebel organization. So again, I don't know if that addresses your question, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
You come to the other side and start off with this. Oh, there's another microphone on that side, but the lady in the white.
So take two questions.
Oh, you think it's easier to take two at a time? Yeah, why don't I do that? I take yours, and then there was one behind and more towards the center, row back.
Hi there. Thank you for your presentation. My name's Maggie Fick with the Enough Project. And I wanted to go to your first chart where you showed the 171 African rebel groups broken down by countries. And I think it makes a lot of sense, obviously, that Chad, Uganda, Sudan, they're very high up in terms of the number of groups. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting that Mali and Niger show up in your top 10. And I was thinking that might have to do with the Tuareg rebellions that have happened. They're the two rebellions. So I'm wondering how that might affect your data, sort of recurrent civil war, or more like rebellions with Niger and Mali, that don't necessarily have different aims. Granted, they might have different leaders, but some of the new leaders, or some of the leaders in the current ongoing Mali and Niger Tuareg rebellions are the same as the previous ones. So are those, I would think they're still counted as different rebel groups, but do you see, does it make sense?
Right. No, I mean, right. I mean, so, if an one could look at how rebel organizations have been defined, right? And so the way the actual coding works out, and you can argue with me about this if you like, maybe a shortcoming of the way the data is put together, but if a rebel organization sort of formally announces itself has a leader, sort of falls off the map for 5-6 years and then reappears, right? That's sort of coded as one rebel organization, right? And depending how you look at it, that may be a shortcoming of the data, but that's a choice that we sort of made.
I actually suspect in the Chad case it's a different problem, and that is that basically the same group keeps appearing under a different name and a slightly different leadership. Well, what you're seeing is just the same thing over and over and over again, but the data, and it's PRIO data, I mean, I'm with you completely on that. The PRIO data shows it as 20 different rebel groups, but it's the same guy. I mean, it's the same small group, not the same guy, but the same small set of elites with interests, and it has to do with struggles for power.
And this, and
that's how PRIO does it.
And that's essentially how PRIO does it, right? And so one can begin to see the real difficulties of defining what is a rebel organization, when does a rebel organization exist, really when does fragmentation occur? And I mean, it's incredibly difficult. And from our vantage point here in Washington, D.C., it was very difficult for both Brian and I to decide, is this a new rebel organization? Has it fragmented? It's a challenge, right? And that's why I share many of your concerns about the actual data. That's why it's preliminary.
The gentleman has the microphone.
Thank you very much. My name is Bahati Ntama, and I work with Africa Faith and Justice Network. I'm interested in the question of why rebel group fragment, and I would like you to speak on that issue using looking at that question as a war method. I would give an example of the Congo, where you have Rwanda creating more rebel movement to win a war. And then you see them dividing those existing rebel groups. Also, I want you to look at existing rebel groups in Africa and relate to those to bystanding nations using rebel group as a way of accessing to resources, looking at the history of Africa with colonization and neocolonization. So how do you explain bystanding nations that create rebel groups for them to have somebody in the government who can work for them?
Let me actually take a second question and group together. I stepped on my own pattern last time.
Charles Gurney, Department of State. It's interesting that the question of ethnicity didn't seem to come up very much. Were you able to draw a conclusion that ethnicity was not a driving force of fragmentation, or is it something that you simply haven't addressed at this point?
Right. No, I mean, I think ethnicity certainly plays a role. And many of the organizations that are in this data set are ethnically diverse organizations, and oftentimes, ethnic tensions often lead to rebel fragmentation. But that's sort of a structural issue, and so it doesn't really allow us to get at the actual timing of fragmentation. Right. This is what I would argue. And so, for example, the SPLA, was a hodgepodge of different ethnic groups, right? But the fact that there was ethnic diversity doesn't exactly explain why in 1990 they actually fractured, right? Those tensions were always there, right? So definitely an important factor, right? Important structural factor. But in terms of the actual timing of this event, I don't think it is an adequate explanation, I would say. With respect to your question, all very good questions. Rebel organizations as a war method, right? And so the idea that the fragmentation of rebel organizations may be, that the fragmentation of rebel organizations is basically sort of part of the strategy of a government, right? Am I following you correctly? That may very well be the case, and that would fall under what I consider to be external shocks, right? In terms of how I view the dynamic between a leader and organizational elites, my assumption is that the leader never wants the movement to fragment, right? And he does everything that he can to prevent that, right? And in many ways, his interests then come up against the interests of other actors in the environment, be it the state or external powers, what have you. So.
Can I use, you take the chair's prerogative to follow up on that. What you said, the leader never wants the movement to fracture. It leads me to a larger question, and that is to look at the distinction between the phenomenon you're looking at as a splintering, a breaking away versus a process of expulsion. Just as imagine it as a stylized story. One member of the leadership says, "I want a larger share of power." Another leader says, "I won't give it to you," and then there's a split. Is that best understood as fragmentation, a group breaking away, or rather as a leader consolidating, I was going to say his power, and pushing somebody else out of the movement? Just the first example that occurs to me is a non-African example, but that the IRA kicks out the real IRA as part of a political strategy. In fact, strengthens the IRA. The leadership wanted that expulsion,
right?
Which is a fracture in another way of looking at it, right?
Right. No, certainly. I think often you talk about the difference between expulsion and splintering, and oftentimes leaders do expel organizational elites. The only thing is that they don't want them to leave with a significant amount of resources or significant constituency. This is what I would argue because it damages the long-term capabilities of their organization. And if you see, if you think back, that's how I've sort of defined rebel organizations as, or rather, as fracturing, right? Sort of a non-trivial split, right? Mm-hmm. And because I define it as a non-trivial split, I think I'm sort of bypassing this issue of expulsion, right? so clearly cases of expulsion are sort of excluded, I think, from the data.
Because you'd only exclude a trivial portion.
Exactly, right. Which is what I would consider be expulsion.
Okay.
Right.
Excellent. Questions? Back here, I'm going to take two again.
Hi, I'm Josh Kennedy from the Genocide Intervention Network. I was wondering how you account for rebel movements who cross international boundaries and perhaps are rebelling against two different international governments. So take, for example, the FDLR in the Eastern Congo, who has a kind of tacit rebellion against the Rwandan government, but is also rebelling against the Congolese government at the same time.
My understanding is that PRIO would code that as one organization, right? And sort of look at sort of the country out of which it emerged, right? And so you see similar things with rebel movements in Chad, also operating in Darfur, and et cetera. And so, so that would be coded as one rebel organization, right? Which makes sense, right? So.
Another question. Is that a question? Yes, up here in the front.
Thank you. Ed Barber from Good Works International. We're a consulting firm that does business in Africa. Over the course of years and years of working on Africa, I've had any number of discussions about whether such and such an insurgency was primarily motivated by religion or by politics or by ethnicity or by state oppression, or pick your cause. That gets to the discussion you had earlier about motivation. And this being Washington, we're all interested in, well, okay, faced by an insurgency, what do you do about it? And that answer to that depends critically on the mix of motives among the factors I mentioned. So I guess I'm putting in more than a question, I'm putting in a pitch for your field research to get into some anecdotal evidence about how these various motivations are intertwined. And maybe that's one of those eternal questions to answer definitively, but I think in the policy area it's one that will be of supreme interest.
Right. No, certainly a valid point. And I tend to think of rebel organizations, I think the sort of grounding assumption of this study is that there's sort of multiple motivations at work in the context of rebel organizations. And so oftentimes, a breakdown of cooperation often means sort of a divergence of interests. Motives are no longer incompatible. One could see it that way, if in fact it is a story of preference divergence. As I said, it could also be about commitment problems, right? But no, certainly a valid point.
Yes, sir, again.
Yeah.
One of the conclusions that perhaps one can sort of draw from what you're saying is that it's probably better for governments, as a policy matter, to allow rebel groups to consolidate in order to be able to negotiate with one person over 55, right? If that is the case, then why do so many governments move to break up and divide the rebel groups? That's their policy preference, almost always. What explains sort of this empirical and theoretical anomaly?
Right. Well, one issue is that they may not recognize that the proliferation of rebel groups actually extends the duration of civil wars.
Yeah, but that means that the governments are not learning beings themselves, but they are
right, or perhaps that they're imperfect, right? I mean, states,
over a 60-year period of time, they'll be learning.
They may. States can also, as we know, can be dysfunctional and be irrational actors, right? But honestly, right? And so, this question, one could also view it in terms of, the idea, the calculation of a state may be, if we divide these rebel organizations at the bargaining table, we can achieve, we can get we can have a better negotiating position.
Absolutely, that is the thinking. The issue is that why would governments consistently choose this option over a 60-year period, knowing that your chart shows that if you split them up, you probably are going to get state failure at the end, you're going to get prolonged conflict at the end, you're not going to get peace at the end. So that's the anomaly. The anomaly is a choice made over a consistent period of, a long period of time versus, and looking at the consequences thereof, which is, bad things happen when you try to break up rebel groups.
Right. No, I mean, no doubt, certainly an empirical anomaly, right? But the question is, right, do our states aware of this, right? Are states reading political science literature, and do they know, right? And so, and I would argue perhaps they don't, right? And we could think of a multitude of stories about state leaders who are frankly not the most rational of beings, right? And so,
well, they may not be rational beings, but what they have a great awareness. Political leaders have a great awareness of their self-interest, right? They have a supreme idea about what will keep them in power and what won't keep them in power, much more so than political scientists, I would say. So, in a sense, they would have a better idea over a period of time, looking at evidence, looking at what's happening, to say maybe we shouldn't splinter them, and yet they do.
I would argue there's also another case in which the splintering may in fact work for the government. Splintering UNITA, Angola government policies to splinter UNITA, bring some on board, marginalize Savimbi, worked. Precisely. They won the war, and so it was they got their first order preference rather than a second order preference of having to cut a peace deal. So
Right, and it's right. No, I mean it's also important to realize that these are general. These are sort of general trends. So it's not the case, right, that the fragmentation of rebel organizations always leads to longer civil wars, right? And there are exceptions to the rule.
Other questions? I see one back here, and then up in the front row. Just do you get the microphone there, and then up here the gentleman in the blue shirt.
Yeah, my name is Jim Tufa. I'm from the Oromo Community Center. I was just wondering the role of religion in splintering these rebel movements in Africa. If you take the Horn of Africa, for example, Eritrea in particular, there was religious cleavages between the ELF and EPLF and so on and so forth. Have you looked into the data?
Right. I think this returns to the point we made earlier about ethnicity and other issues of identity. I think in the case of the OLF, sort of the split between, for example, in the 1980s, the split between Christians and Muslims in the OLF, in many ways, was the raw material that sort of caused sort of the fragmentation of that organization. But again, so that would be sort of a structural issue, right? The split of the ELF. In large part was a result of tensions between Christians and Muslims and the overriding sort of Islamic character of the ELF, right? And that's how the EPLF came to be, right? Out of that. But again, right? I mean, ethnic diversity, religious diversity, was part of that organization. So from its inception, right? So we then need, I think, a different sort of explanation when we talk about the actual timing, right? Well, why in 1984-85 does the EPLF split, right? Does the OLF split? Why is it that in 1970, 3 fractions break off from the ELF? Why 1970 and not 1963, 1964, right? So again, identity is certainly important. Sort of important background issue, but when you talk about the precipitating causes, right? I think we may need a different theory.
Up here, and I'll try to get it. There's somebody else who wants to get in. I'll try to put 2 questions together, but sir.
E.J. Hogan, actually also with Princeton University.
Okay.
I had 2 questions. One was, what's the impact of state power? In this respect, I mean the issue of what would the threat of a viable military defeat do to tendencies to fractionalize or not, and thus the converse being if there is a stalemate or if there's a long-standing war where very little changes, what would that mean for fractionalization? And perhaps it gets a little bit at this issue of duration fractionalization as opposed to fractionalization leading to duration, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And the other question is one of opportunity. And actually one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Lyons is when he described the Horn of Africa as a Hobbesian place. And he was referring at the time, I believe, if I remember correctly, to the fact that all the different states in the region had their own efforts to arm different insurgencies in different countries. And you certainly see that happening, well, you still continue to see that happening in the Horn of Africa, but when you have all these different neighboring states wanting to incite insurgencies and willing to provide arms to almost any rebel leader that's fit to be named so with arms, what does that mean for fractionalization and splintering?
Mm-hmm. No, I mean.
Let me get one more. If I can get the lady right there, and just combine a couple of questions to make sure we get everybody in.
I just wanted to add to the discussion about the state and the external shock of fragmentation. Perhaps we could look at things a different way. Sometimes, as William Zartman said, you have a soft stalemate where the state and the rebels, or elements of the state and elements of the rebels, benefit from conflict and ongoing conflict. And it could be that your notion of cooperation could be that these groups are agreeing to cooperate to maintain and sustain a conflict from which all are benefiting in one way or another, either by stealing resources or becoming involved in some form of political activity related to a neighboring state, etc.
No,
go ahead.
Very, very good point. I mean, I think oftentimes, a key determinant of cooperation may be sort of continued warfare and the rewards to be got from continued warfare and violence. No, very good point. With respect to your two questions, I think actually very good points. And as I've thought about external shocks that may that may cause fragmentation, I've thought about sort of the role of state power, but also sort of variation in external support. And I do actually think there's a relationship between state power and the fragmentation of rebel organizations. And oftentimes, periods of rapid organizational success and sort of a collapsing state often create the conditions, I think, for the fragmentation of rebel organizations. And so when you heard me talk about sort of the increasing value of leadership, right, and how this can create either preference divergence or some sort of commitment problems, I think this is sort of consistent with this issue of sort of variations in state power and then the issues you raised. With respect to external support, I mean the fact that oftentimes rebel organizations are basically artifacts of the interests of external powers suggests that variation in the actual support of these external powers for these rebel organizations could be a key determinant of fragmentation, right? So, I would go back to my example of the SPLA and the withdrawal of Ethiopian support for the SPLA and how this may have created some sort of commitment problem between organizational elites and the leader, right? And organizational elites. Some of these organizational elites had been key allies of the Ethiopian government, and sort of felt as if their key backer was gone, and Garang could basically do anything they wanted to him. This would be sort of one example, right? But we could think about a variety of scenarios where sort of the shock of either losing external support or gaining some sort of external support affects fragmentation patterns. But again, I'm sort of agnostic about what those shocks would be at this point.
You have a quick follow-on, or?
Is it on? Yeah.
Now it's on.
I apologize, but another story you could say about Ethiopia pulling out is, well, a lot of other countries stepped in to fill the breach. You had Eritrea, you had continued support from Kenya, you had Uganda. Other people would say the United States and some other countries also were very helpful to the SPLA, and certainly you did see a lot of fragmentation at this time. And at the same time, I would also say that the SPLA at that time, at least from what I understand of it, was far from monolithic. I mean, they may have papered over many differences that they already had, but from all I understand, during this period of time, a lot of these organizations or a lot of the commanders were operating relatively autonomously and were only nominally under the authority of Garang. I know you've already identified coding as a big problem.
Did we get a couple more questions in the back? Is there a second question, some comment somebody wants to make? In the far back. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Kathy Crew, National Intelligence Council. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the policy prescription side. You mentioned that there would be a different policy response depending on which path to breakdown and commitment you have. And you had a couple of examples that are sort of in both categories, for example, the SPLA. And I'm wondering what it would be the difference in approach, policy approach to, say, the SPLA in the mid-90s if you diagnose it as a preference divergence versus a commitment problem, and what do you do in cases where maybe it's both?
Right.
I can take two questions just to get as many in the back row, please. It's not on for some reason.
Mullen, and I wanted to ask a follow-up on what one of the women was saying about the rebels really gaining and being independent. For instance, in Colombia, because of the money they get from the kidnappings, aren't they fairly well off? Are some of the rebels in Africa fairly well off and could live with quite a bit of money and have quite a bit of power because of the money that they get from, say, kidnapping?
Mm-hmm. So the question was, I mean...
I know that you're not studying Colombia, but the question was, are there rebels that are very wealthy because of their position, and as they are, for instance, in Colombia, or at least how I'm not a specialist in Colombia, but from what I understand, they're very wealthy from the kidnappings. And
no, I mean, certainly, I mean, I think there's certainly an element of profit to all civil wars, right? You know, and whether you're talking about FARC, or whether you're talking about the Tamil Tigers, I mean, clearly, you know, these organizations basically sustain themselves, you know, through their access to certain goods, right? And so yeah, no, I completely. Some of them are quite wealthy. Some are more wealthy than others, right? The EPLF was actually not really a resource-rich organization, and really depended in many ways on the support of the population, right? Because they didn't have access to natural resources, and that then, at least in Weinstein's story, which I talked about up here, really impacted the sort of social dynamics of these organizations. With respect to policy prescriptions, really good question. I'm not exactly sure what the policy prescription would be in a case of preference divergence, right? I mean, how does one? I mean, depending on what you know, I guess it would depend on, you know, how one realigns interests, and this is assuming you want to hold these organizations together, right? How you realign interests will really depend on what that interest divergence is, right? And so if it's a question of economic rewards, you know, perhaps external actors, you know, could provide certain economic rewards to organizational elites, provide sort of rewards for them to stay in a movement, right? This would be one story. In terms of credible commitments, international actors could often step in and say, you know, if you go out and persecute your subordinates, could say this to a leader. If you go out and persecute your subordinates, you know, we'll come down on you, right? And in that way, an external actor can come in and make a commitment credible, right? Can make the cooperative arrangement credible. So I think these are some ways that we could think about it. In response to the issues that you raised with SPLA, no, certainly very persuasive points. I think my understanding is that there was a lull in sort of the external support that the SPLA was able to acquire, right? So, you know, remember, Eritrea doesn't formally become a state, I think, until the referendum of 1993. So, I mean, it wasn't the case that, you know, they lost Ethiopian support, and the next day, you know, they got support from a variety of other external actors. I think this sort of took time. But no, I mean, certainly downstream, they were able to reacquire external support. So.
Anybody else who hasn't had a chance to have a question? Otherwise, let's go back to the gentleman in the center.
I would like you to comment on how sustainable the cohesion has been for rebel groups that have external connections like Western connection in terms of material, providing the money and to boost their political agendas.
How sustainable is cooperation?
Yes.
Right. Well, I mean, it would sort of depend. I mean, at least in Weinstein's story, right, resource-rich organizations are probably those most likely to be fragmented, right? And his story, it essentially has to do with recruitment, right? And if you have a lot of money, in the short term, it's more efficient to simply provide material incentives to recruits, right? And so you're attracting a particular kind of recruit because you're attracting opportunists, and therefore, fragmentation is more likely. And so, I think there's actually something to this theory. He's got some pretty robust results. I think, as we spoke of earlier, I think it's quite possible that fluctuations in external support, if an organization has basically been holding itself together through the external support, some foreign power, right, and is basically using those resources to pay off, and the leader is using those resources to pay off a leader, it's not a very stable foundation. And, if you lose external support, under those conditions, you've got no way to pay off your subordinates, and fragmentation may be the consequence, right? So
I see one more question here and one here. Anybody else want to get in before we do a final wrap-up? We'll have those two questions, then I'll have one final comment to make. Yeah, in the back, sir.
A follow-on on the kind of external support in the case of blood diamonds or timber in Liberia is that the external support could be commercial, which through pressure can be removed, or it can be external state-sponsored subsidy of rebel movements for countries which threaten the security of another country or something like that. So they can be both commercial as well as governmental.
Right. No, that's an excellent point, right? Excellent point.
Let me get this last gentleman in here in the middle here.
Joseph from University of Virginia. One of the things that you pointed out that the fragmentation occurs in the rebel group in lack of, policing or whatever, lack of principle of agent problem. Mm-hmm. Did you think about sort of other way when rebel groups sort of transformed themselves into more sort of organized, started to policing their structure, started to build up more sort of internal hierarchies that will lead to a fragmentation? I'm just pointing out Tamil Tigers, which is I've been studying last maybe 15 years, which is highly disciplined, very organized rebel groups, and during the last peace process, there was a huge split within the group. One of the things is that my conclusion was because the organization started to structure itself more sort of a well-organized non-state actors that lead to a fragmentation within that organization.
Right. So in essence, it was sort of an issue of lack of democracy within these organizations.
Yeah, when they try to democratize themselves, there isn't a split happen, I think.
Right. I've tended to treat the organizational structures of rebel organizations as fairly constant, and I think that that is a shortcoming of the study. So I tend to think of shortcoming of my approach. So I tend to think that some organizations that start off as democratic tend to persist as democratic, and others that are highly repressive tend to persist that way. I think there are minor variations in organizational structures, but overall, from what I've seen, organizational structures tend to persist, right? And because they tend to persist, and because they're a constant, one sort of gets at sort of the, does this really address the timing of fragmentation? And I'm not exactly sure. And so this is not to say that rebel organizations don't evolve. They certainly do. I just don't think rebel organizations evolve as much as we think, at least with respect to issues of sort of democracy and et cetera. So.
I want to, first of all, thank you for your thoughtful responses to all of those questions, but then to conclude with a kind of a, what are you going to do with the rest of your life question, now that your Africanist doctoral fellowship is ending, but to ask it more specifically about this research project. Mostly what you talked about today was the data set that you developed over the summer. If I understand correctly, your next step is to try to do some more fine-grained case studies in the Horn of Africa. And so my question to you is, how on earth do you get the data for that? These leadership challenges are often not talked about. Those who fail in leadership challenges often are not available for interviewing, meaning that the challengers often aren't around, except in Sudan they become foreign ministers. But in any event, usually that data is very hard to get. Organizations don't want to talk about the challenges that come from within. Insurgent organizations are not very good at keeping archives, although not always the case, as we talked about once. But how do you go from the PRIO data set to what really happened within the USC? Or the OLF, or any of the other Horn cases?
I think this is sort of the key challenge I face, right? I mean, how does one actually conduct research in this kind of environment, right? Where the actors may be, people of interest may be unwilling to talk about certain issues that have to do with the internal politics of an organization of which they were a part. They may be dead. My only response would be, I'll try and do the best with the access that I have and with the information I'm able to collect. I think it's important, to sort of, and what I've tried to do is try and build a relationship with a lot of these organizations, a lot of these rebel organizations. So in the case of the EPLF, I've tried to speak with people who are not, the EPLF is now in government, and so I've tried to speak with people in the EPLF and people sort of way up in the organizational hierarchy and sort of get their permission to sort of do this study, right? So that there is an element of sort of compliance and sort of the impression at least that I'm non-threatening. In that this is a research question, and I'm not really interested in sort of in making sort of odd political claims. That this is an important research question, and I think they'd be a good case for study. So.
I want to thank you again for both your presentation and response to the questions. Thank the audience, and wish you well on the continuing finalizing.
Yeah,
research.
Thank you for coming.